Welcome to the Bible Book Club. Now, some of you have asked if you can give to the podcast, and for the first time ever, the answer is yes. Bible Book Club is officially a nonprofit, and you can give to it. So, what are you giving to? Well, we're rather simple in our structure. Heather, Buck, Haley, and I do this in our free time. That means all of your gifts will be used to reach new listeners. Currently, the podcast has grown by word of mouth and just $1,000 a month of personal funds used to reach new listeners through digital ads. But think about how much we could grow the podcast in 2025 if you gave and we doubled or tripled that monthly spend. Ponder the math and consider giving today so that we can reach more listeners like you. We will put the link to donate in the show notes. Thank you for listening and giving.
Welcome to the club and the book of 2 Kings. In chapters 22 and 23 of 2 Kings, King Josiah discovered the long-lost Book of the Law. Written under Moses, this set of scrolls was the crucial set of instructions for how to live in a relationship with God, and it proves that Judah had fallen far. Fortunately for Judah, Josiah was a very good king. He read the book and took immediate action. He called for a covenant renewal, and he demolished idolatry. Despite Judah's reform, the consequences of their past evil prevail. The Lord was firm on his decision to remove Judah from his presence. What follows explains why. There are no good kings left. Josiah's sons both do evil. First, Jehoahaz, who was carried off by Pharaoh Necho of Egypt and died. Then Jehoiakim was made king, and he became a vassal to Pharaoh Necho.
This is the last episode for season 12. All good and bad kings must come to an end for a time, until we get to the only king who will never do evil, but instead will overcome evil with good in the New Testament. Now, in the next 3 scenes of this episode, there will be 3 Babylon invasions of Judah. In the first invasion, Jehoiakim is king. He is a vassal to Egypt and Pharaoh Necho. Scene 1, the first Babylonian invasion against King Jehoiakim.
Chapter 24. During Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land, and Jehoiakim became a vassal for 3 years.
Now, Jehoiakim was a puppet king. He played vassal to whoever chose to threaten him, first to Pharaoh Necho and now to King Nebuchadnezzar. However, Jehoiakim must have liked being subject to Pharaoh Necho better because he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. He probably thought the Pharaoh would come to his rescue.
But then he turned against Nebuchadnezzar and rebelled. The Lord sent Babylonian, Aramean, Moabite, and Ammonite raiders against him to destroy Judah in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by his servants, the prophets. Surely these things happened to Judah according to the Lord's command, in order to remove them from his presence because of the sins of Manasseh and all he had done, including the shedding of innocent blood. For he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord was not willing to forgive. As for the other events of Jehoiakim's reign and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Jehoiakim rested with his ancestors, and Jehoiakim, his son, succeeded him as king. The king of Egypt did not march out from his own country because the king of Babylon had taken all his territory, from the Wadi of Egypt to the Euphrates River.
Jehoiakim rebels against Nebuchadnezzar, but to no avail, because the Lord had sent not just Babylon, but other raiders to destroy Judah because of their sin. And Egypt would never come to Judah's rescue because Babylon got them too. Now, why did the Lord send long-standing enemies of Israel, Aramean, Moabite, and Ammonite raiders against Judah?
Well, in order to remove them from his presence because his sins of Manasseh and all that he had done, which is what it just said in what we read.
Exactly. The very nations that God had given Israel victory over in the past are now nations that God is giving the victory to. All because Israel had left God. Therefore, God will remove his presence from Israel for a time, because even though Israel is faithless, God is faithful. This Babylonian victory was the beginning of the march to captivity. In the book of Daniel, chapter 1, we will learn that it was during this invasion that,
starting in verse 3, then King Nebuchadnezzar ordered Aphanas, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego.
in this first invasion of Babylon, the best of the royal family and noblemen were taken with them, including Daniel and the audacious Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Scene 2, the second Babylonian invasion against King Jehoiakim.
Verse 8, Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. His mother's name was Nehushta, daughter of Elnathan. She was from Jerusalem. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father had done. At that time, the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to it, and Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city while his officers were besieging it. Jehoiakim, king of Judah, his mother, his attendants, his nobles, and his officials all surrendered to him. In the 8th year of the reign of the king of Babylon, he took Jehoiakim prisoner.
Nebuchadnezzar must have been miffed about Jehoiakim's father's rebellion because he takes it upon himself to attack the capital of Jerusalem. Jehoiakim surrenders and is taken prisoner. Now note, Jehoiakim is not the last king, but he is the only king to survive in captivity. This means that the Davidic line will continue through him and not through the king that is next appointed, named Zedekiah. So if you fast forward to Matthew 1, Matthew lists the genealogy of Christ, and the Davidic line before the exile ends with Jehoiakim, also called Jeconiah. Then Matthew picks up the genealogy after the exile to Babylon with Jehoiakim's son Shealtiel.
So basically, the line of Judah is going to survive, but not as king at this point because other people take over.
No, so there will we'll get to it, but after King Jehoiakim, Zedekiah is appointed. Zedekiah is going to die. Jehoiakim, we're going to get to the end of this episode, actually lives, and so do his sons, but none of them become king.
Right.
There will be no more kings.
There are no more kings from the line of Judah. The kings, then it's Babylon is taking over, right? And do they eventually become Rome? How does that?
No. So we're going to get to it, but there will be a remnant who returns to Jerusalem years from now. We got to get through a lot of books, but Nehemiah, Ezra.
And they come back and rebuild.
They come back. And some of those will be Jehoiakim's descendants. So eventually in Matthew, they do trace the genealogy, from Abraham through David to past the kings. It doesn't mean there'll always be a king.
It just means they live on and the line is carried on.
Correct.
Yeah.
The line of David is carried.
Okay. Now back to our story in verse 13. As the Lord had declared, Nebuchadnezzar removed the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal palace and cut up the gold articles that Solomon, king of Israel, had made for the temple of the Lord. He carried all Jerusalem into exile, all the officers and fighting men and all the skilled workers and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left. Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim captive to Babylon. He also took from Jerusalem to Babylon the king's mother, his wives, his officials, and the prominent people of the land. The king of Babylon also deported to Babylon the entire force of 7,000 fighting men, strong and fit for war, and 1,000 skilled workers and artisans. He made Mattaniah, Jehoiakim's uncle, king in his place and changed his name to Zedekiah.
In this second invasion, Jerusalem was totally ravaged. Nebuchadnezzar removed, took, carried away, exiled, and deported King Jehoiakim and his family, treasures from the temple and palace, 10,000 people, including all the officers and military men and all the skilled workers and artisans. Remember, he's already taken noblemen in the last invasion. Nothing was left except the poorest of people. Nebuchadnezzar leaves Jehoiakim's uncle in charge as king and changes his name to Zedekiah. Scene 3, the third Babylonian invasion, this time against King Zedekiah.
Verse 18, Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. His mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah. She was from Libnah. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as Jehoiakim had done. It was because of the Lord's anger that all this happened to Jerusalem and Judah, and in the end, he thrust them from his presence.
The author is clear here. In the end, Jerusalem and Judah, like Samaria and Israel, disobeyed to the extent that the Lord would no longer tolerate their evil. And he thrust them from his presence. It sounds so forceful. His presence was in the temple. So not only are they going to be thrown out of the promised land, but God is going to allow the seat of his presence among them to be destroyed. The temple that David so wanted to build, the temple that Solomon so reverently designed, would fall into rubble, a visible sign of Judah's fall from God.
Verse 20, now Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon.
I don't know what he was thinking. Zedekiah rebels, which is crazy because they are down to just the poorest people and they don't have a chance against Babylon. Unless, of course, the Lord was on their side, but Zedekiah did evil in the eyes of the Lord and would be insane to think that God would rescue them. Most likely, Zedekiah had been blinded to the truth of Judah's situation. God's plan was judgment for Judah. Sometimes the leaders God gives a nation are a part of his judgment on that nation. This is a note for us. As our nation bounces back and forth between presidents of different parties, and we as citizens watch policies ping-pong with growing frustration, it might be wise to consider, what is the state of our nation in God's eyes? How would the author of Kings describe our presidents, governors, senators, representatives, and mayors? Do they do what is right in the eyes of the Lord? Or do they do evil in the eyes of the Lord? How can we use our collective opportunity to vote for leaders who will do right in the eyes of the Lord? How can we raise up or support future leaders who will do right in the eyes of the Lord? How can we step up and out to become a leader who will do right in the eyes of the Lord?
Moving on to chapter 25 of 2 Kings. So, in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled towards the Arba, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon.
Zedekiah didn't stand a chance, and Nebuchadnezzar was tired of messing around with Judah. He marched his entire army to Jerusalem and surrounded the city. And then from the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign to the 11th year, an estimated year and a half, the Babylonians starved the city of Jerusalem. Finally, knowing the people were too weak to resist, the Babylonians broke in. The Israelite army, or what was left of it, fled through another gate. King Zedekiah was captured and taken to Nebuchadnezzar. They killed his sons before his eyes, blinded him, bound him, and took him to Babylon, which fulfilled the prophecy in Ezekiel 12.
Starting in verse 13, I will bring him to Babylonia, the land of the Chaldeans, but he will not see it, and there he will die. I will scatter to the winds all those around him, his staff and all his troops, and I will pursue them with drawn sword.
Zedekiah was brought to Babylon, but could not see it, for he was blind, and there he died a captive. The kingdom of Judah is no more. Scene 4, the temple destroyed. The temple, the seat of God's presence, is a bookend around 1st and 2nd Kings. We began the books of Kings with the building of the temple. We end the books of Kings with the destruction of the temple. The author is making a point. In between the beginning and the end of the temple, we covered the story of all the kings and their kingdoms. First, the kingdom split into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Then most of the kings in both kingdoms did evil despite the prophets sent by God to guide them. Lastly, both kingdoms were destroyed and forced back into slavery where they had originally come from. The temple is the beginning and ending of the story of the kings and kingdoms. Why? The whole purpose of a king was for him to lead the nation in God's ways. The Mosaic covenant with the people and the Davidic covenant with the kings stated that God would dwell among them if they were faithful. So God gave them the temple for his presence among them. And God removed the temple and his presence when they failed to be faithful, because neither the people nor the kings were faithful.
Verse 8, on the 7th day of the 5th month in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace of those who had deserted to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and fields.
The city David built burned. The temple Solomon built burned. More people carried into exile. Now, only a few poor farmers remain.
Verse 13, the Babylonians broke up the bronze pillars, the movable stands, and the bronze sea that were at the temple of the Lord, and they carried the bronze to Babylon. They also took away the pots, shovels, wick trimmers, dishes, and all the bronze articles used in the temple service. The commander of the imperial guard took away the censers and sprinkling bowls and all that were made of pure gold or silver. The bronze from the 2 pillars, the sea, and the movable stands, which Solomon had made for the temple of the Lord, was more than could be weighed. Each pillar was 18 cubits high. The bronze capital on top of one pillar was 3 cubits high and was decorated with a network and pomegranates of bronze all around. The other pillar, with its network, was similar.
So if you were with us in, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, I'm trying to think, you would know how amazingly detailed this temple was. And now all the temple articles crafted and designed under Solomon, the enormous bronze pillars and the bronze sea, which were huge, the elaborate gold and silver censers and bowls, All were carefully designed to reflect the Garden of Eden. All were destroyed and carried off to be used by people who did not worship God.
Verse 18, the commander of the guard took as prisoners Sariah the chief priest, Zephaniah the priest next in rank, and the 3 doorkeepers. Of those still in the city, he took the officer in charge of the fighting men and 5 royal advisors. He also took the secretary, who was the chief officer in charge of conscripting the people of the land, and 60 of the conscripts who were found in the city. Nebuzaradan, the commander, took them all and brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. There at Riblah, in the land of Hamath, the king had them executed.
Everyone and anyone of importance, the priests, the officers, and the royal advisors, were marched to Riblah and executed.
Verse 21 continued, so Judah went into captivity away from her land.
Israel is now back where it began, in captivity, this time in Babylon rather than Egypt, deprived of promised land, deprived of the presence of the Lord, exactly like Adam and Eve had been exiled, deprived of the Garden of Eden and deprived of the presence of God. Scene 5, Gedaliah fails and the people flee.
Verse 22, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, appointed Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, to be over the people he had left behind in Judah. When all the army officers and their men heard that the king of Babylon had appointed Gedaliah as governor, they came to Gedaliah at Mizpah. Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, Jonathan, son of Kerah, Sariah, son of Tunameth, the Neophatite, Jaazaniah, the son of Maakathite, and their men. Gedaliah took an oath to reassure them and their men. Do not be afraid of the Babylonian officials, he said. Settle down in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it will go well with you. In the 7th month, however, Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, the son of Elishama, who was the royal blood, came with 10 men and assassinated Gedaliah, and also the men of Judah and the Babylonians who were with him in Mizpah. At this, all the people from the least to the greatest, together with the army officers, fled to Egypt for fear of the Babylonians.
So Gedaliah is appointed governor, and he's the grandson of Shaphan, and he actually had a really good reputation, which we'd expect, because remember, Shaphan was the one who read the book of the law to Josiah. So Gedaliah meets with several other Judean officers who had fled from Nebuchadnezzar and returned to meet with Gedaliah. One of them, Ishmael, was a royal, in other words, somehow related to David, and he felt he had more of a right to be in charge than Gedaliah, so he assassinates him. This was a bold but bad move against Babylon, because remember, Nebuchadnezzar had appointed Gedaliah. The people knew it, and they flee in fear to Egypt. Scene 6, Jehoiakim remains the only glimmer of hope.
Verse 27, in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the year Awel-Maduk became king of Babylon, he released Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. He did this on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor, higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put aside his prison clothes and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day, the king gave Jehoiakim a regular allowance as long as he lived.
All the other kings are killed by Nebuchadnezzar, and yet this one king is still alive. Jehoiakim not only survives, but thrives. He somehow providentially finds favor with the new king of Babylon. Jehoiakim was taken into captivity at the age of 18. This is 37 years later. He is now about 55 years old. The new Babylonian king is kind to Jehoiakim, and he was provided for as long as he lived. So, left in the line of David, there is just one ray of hope. Jehoiakim and his sons must carry the Davidic line to that Redeemer King who will crush the head of the serpent, as we are told in Genesis 3:15. But there is another remnant going on somewhere in Babylon. God is at work through others. Remember Daniel. Somewhere nearby, he is preserving the faith also. There's always a remnant. There's always hope for the faithful. This is the conclusion of the books of Kings. We have journeyed through 42 kings since the first king in 1 Samuel chapter 10. Of the 42 kings, there were only 5 very good kings and 5 lukewarm kings. The good kings were David, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, and Josiah. These kings worshiped God alone, removed idolatry, and restored temple worship in the covenant. The lukewarm kings were Solomon, Joash, Amaziah, Azariah, who's also called Uzziah, and Jotham. These kings had spiritual lapses and or neglected to remove idolatry. You can now check off all 42 kings off your reading list, and kudos to you because you have survived 32 evil kings. That's a lot. Now, the author has made his intended point in writing these books. Rebellion and unfaithfulness lead to exile. The people must understand that the covenant with God was about relationship. Relationship with God was the core of all the covenants. Israel rejected the covenants and rebelled against God, which moved them farther and farther away from God until they landed in exile. So what's next? The story of the kings of Israel is really part of a much larger narrative. It's a story that, remember, began in Genesis with Abraham when God chose one family. The story continued in Exodus with Moses when God made Abraham's family into a nation called Israel. The story continued in Joshua when God gave the nation of Israel a promised land. In a perfect world, that should have been a good thing. However, when the story continued in Judges 21, verse 25, we discovered that
Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes.
So in 1st and 2nd Samuel, God gave Israel 2 kings. A bad example, Saul, followed by a king with a heart for the Lord, David, from the tribe of Judah, which led to what we just completed in 1st and 2nd Kings. These 2 books are the history of all the kings who came after David and their failure, most of the time, to be faithful to God. God has made his case. It is obvious from the repetitive failings of the kings that no human king will ever suffice. Humanity needs a savior king, and that king must come from the family of Abraham, the nation of Israel, the tribe of Judah, and the kingly line of David. From here on out, there will be no more kings until Jesus. God's point stands. The people need a king who can save them from their sin. A strictly human king won't work. They need a king born of God. They need the one that was with God in the beginning, the Word, life, light, the one who can shine through the darkness of our sins and overcome it.
John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.
Until that king comes, the Word, life, and light, Israel will have to wait. Okay, so what will become of Israel? What will become of God's chosen family of Abraham, the nation of Israel, the tribe of Judah, and the line of David, these people that God has chosen and loved? Well, it's a bit of a mystery, says the Apostle Paul in Romans 11. I'm going to have Heather read just verse 25, because I want you to know that there's more about Israel to come.
Romans chapter 11, verse 25. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening, in part, until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved.
So Paul prefaces it by saying, this is a mystery. And there's so many great commentaries on this. I'm not going to go in it. But for those of you who are very discouraged about the poor Israelites that are back in captivity after surviving 400 years of captivity in Egypt, know that God has a plan for them, and we will cover it in the future. For now, stay tuned and journey with us as we dig deeper in season 13 of the Bible Book Club. The book of 1 Chronicles is next.
We've got merch. Great news! Bible Book Club sweatshirts are here, and they're only available while supplies last. So if you want to snag yours, go to BibleBookClubPodcast.com/store. They're only going to be available while supplies last, so hurry and get yours. And if you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you and all your friends can listen and discuss. New episodes drop every Monday.